My name is J. Blake Fichera, and I'm the author of the book Scored to Death 2, More Conversations with Some of Horror's Greatest Composers. And we have a very special conversation today on Fangoria. So make sure for all your horror needs, check out Fangoria. And of course, to check out Fangoria, check out fangoria.com and at Fangoria on social media. And today we have a wonderful panel of composers who are all featured in the new Scored to Death 2 book. We have Holly Amber Church, who has scored such wonderful horror movies as Open 24 Hours, Dark Light, Ruin Me, Bad Impulse, and her Open 24 Hours soundtrack was just recently released on Note for Note Music, so make sure you check that out. Charlie Clouser, who is best known amongst horror fans for scoring the Saw series, including the upcoming Spiral from the Book of Saw. My favorite score of his is Dead Silence, and he's also worked on the Resident Evil series, Resident Evil Extinction. Brad Fiedel, of course, the man who brought us one of the most famous science fiction / horror themes from the Terminator 2 Judgment Day. Another fantastic score, Fright Night, also Fright Night 2, Serpent and the Rainbow, Just Before Dawn, Johnny Mnemonic, and a number of other projects that weren't horror or sci-fi related. And he also wrote a musical called Full Circle. And if you want to check out the audio recording of that, that's on SoundCloud, and it's definitely worth listening. The great John Harrison, who will do anything for a buck. He's a director, assistant director, writer, producer, composer, screwdriver zombie, everything under the sun. He's worked in all facets of the industry, but he's best known for these purposes for scoring Creepshow, Day of the Dead. He also directed and scored some of Tales from the Dark Side, the movie, and he directed the 2009 adaptation of the Book of Blood. And most recently, well, maybe not most recently, but recently he also directed some episodes of the Creepshow series. And last but not least, we have John Massari, who has scored so many things that my generation would recognize, but he's best known for horror fans for scoring Killer Clowns from Outer Space, also contributed to the recent Hellfest, the theme for Ray Bradbury Theater, also scored Retro Puppet Master, scored some of Johnny Quest, everything under the sun. We have a very special panel, so talented, and I'm so pleased that you're all here to talk with me about scoring movies, and I guess specifically the horror genre. But one thing I wanted to start off with, because Brad, it's something that you said when I spoke to you last, that you kind of think of yourself as a filmmaker. You just happen to write music. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how writing music for movies and also theater is kind of a unique position for a composer, because you're writing for somebody else's vision. You're in some ways a slave to the film, the story. And I was wondering, Brad, if you could start us off with kind of talking about being a composer and working on film and having to fulfill somebody else's vision for the movie.
Well, it's interesting to hear myself quoted. I kind of vaguely remember saying that. But I guess really what I was talking about is that I love movies, and that's the place I could be part of the team. That's the natural place I fell into. But the other part of it is that I felt like in talking to directors, they're often, well, it depends on the director, but there's a mystical, unknown, maybe a little bit anxiety creating idea about how the music's going to work for their film and what the music's going to be. So for me, in working with certain directors until maybe, on the first project, down the line, you can get into a shorthand and there's a confidence. But at first, I felt it necessary to really understand what the film was that they were making and what their motivation was and what they were trying to do with the story and the visual style in their impact to the audience. So being able to talk about that as a filmmaker as opposed to a composer,
Yeah.
because it's not about talking about music to me at that point. And really almost always, I would hope, the biggest nightmare to me is when a director in first conversation starts to talk very technically about music, and then I'm like, oh boy, you know, it's like, you know, like, or actually, I'll never forget, and I was kind of nervous sitting with, oh my God, I'm just having a senior moment on Forrest Gump, the actor.
Tom Hanks.
Tom Hanks on From Earth to the Moon, right? And he said to, I walked into his office, he said, I never know what to say to a composer, what to ask you. And I said, well, really, I should be asking you, you know, like, what's up? You know, where are we going? What are you looking for? But it's really important, I think, for a composer to be able to, on one hand, articulate filmmaking ideas. Then for me, after that conversation and the director, producer, whatever is relaxed, then I throw that all out the window and go by my gut, you know, by watching the film and letting it come in and just seeing, you know, what bubbles up, a lot of improvisational experimentation, and then, oh, well, that might work, and then crafting. But it's kind of interesting, that part of being a, quote, filmmaker, understanding editing, understanding all the aspects of the film, understanding how color timing can change the feeling of a scene. And all of a sudden, you know, in the rough cut, it looked one way and you're kind of reacting to the light. And then all of a sudden the director's working with the color timing. You're like, I never really liked the exposure or this or that. And they change the scene and you're like, whoa, that's different. So that's the filmmaking part.
Yeah.
I think, being a composer.
Holly, when you're working with filmmakers, and now you've worked with several filmmakers on several, you know, specific filmmakers on several different projects, but what's, you know, what are some of the things that you're looking for from the director? Are there specific questions that you might ask, or what's the information, and what kind of information do you get from directors that you find most useful?
Yeah, I think it's overall the creative vibe that they want. You know, do they want an electronic score? Do they want an orchestral score? An important thing that comes up a lot is themes, because, you know, in horror, some directors want thematic, melodic things, and some don't at all. Some want like a droney sound design score. So that's an important question to know. Instrumentation that they like. You know, I've had some directors that just really hate piano for some reason. So you want to find that out before you start, you know, those kinds of things. And then overall the story, you know, what are the big points? What are we telling with the characters? That kind of stuff too.
Yeah. What about you, John Massari? You've worked on numerous projects, different styles of things, from television themes to all kinds of different kinds of media. What are you looking for from a director?
Well, I love the director that said, listen, here's my film. Can you lift up the hood and, you know, work on the engine? And that's one of my favorite, when I become part of their creative process, where they said, listen, I brought the project to this point. Now I need you to take it the rest of the way. And there's anticipation of what you're going to do. That's like the best case scenario. And to bounce off Holly Amber Church, there are some directors that, like, for instance, they don't like saxophones, right? It makes them say there's something about saxophones they don't like, so they make a big deal about that. And all of a sudden, the director's tinkering with not only your process, but the mechanics of what makes your score. So now it's great when there's the combination of the two, when they come in with some ideas, or especially with emotional ideas. You know, I don't need this scene to be too terrifying. As a matter of fact, It may seem like I want terrifying music. You could put terrifying music here. I want something very mysterious. So there's a big question mark in the air. So that's kind of my when there's like a back and forth, we have a symbiotic relationship, with the creative, and then at the end of the day, everyone's happy.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
the director's happy, I'm happy, and then the audience has to be happy. That's the biggest determinant of that.
In doing the first book, one of the things that I think Charles Bernstein might have said to me, which I found really interesting, was he kind of equated the way the best relationships he has with the director are when they almost direct him like they direct actors, which is, it is more about feeling and what you're bringing to the scene and the moments, instead of very specific things. And Charlie, do you have anything to add to, you've worked with several directors, like some of them multiple times, especially working on a series like Saw for so many installments, and like taking that musical language from 8, 9 installments. What is working with the director on in general, but also on a series like that like, and what are you looking for?
Well, the Saw movies kind of became sort of almost a self-fulfilling prophecy, and after we got a couple under our belt, it became sort of like, okay, you know what you're doing, so just do your thing, man. But when I was working with James Wan on a couple of the non-Saw movies like Dead Silence or Death Sentence, and especially on Dead Silence, he gave me some great guidance, which I'm sure is something you learn in the first week of film composer school, which I never went to, which was that, this was like the second or third movie that I had ever done. And I just started at the beginning and started grinding away at the thing. And he came in and said, well, I think what you should, and I played him some stuff that was like the first 10 minutes worth or whatever. And we hadn't really met or discussed things in depth at all up to that point. And he wanted it to be very thematic and melodic, and to have like a melodic thread that holds it together from beginning to end. And his instruction was, let's go to the very end of the movie. Let's work out this big end piece, the whole culmination of the movie. And then the musical material from that cue will provide all of the fuel, the DNA for all the rest of the material in the movie. And of course, that was one of those moments where you go, oh yeah, that's how you're supposed to score a movie, right? But not having thought of, because the Saw movies were very much not like that. And the Saw movies, the piece of music that's at the end bears no relationship to the rest of the score. And that was kind of an on purpose thing. We wanted to feel like the lights get turned on and shined in the audience's face at the very end, and it's a big surprise. But it was very different for Dead Silence. So in that case, that was what I did, and it made the job so much easier, because then I had this big elaborate set piece with this, starts off with a little childlike but off-kilter music box melody that then gets big and huge, and the strings come in and they're basically playing the same part. And this huge set piece at the end then provided all the musical knowledge that I needed and could extract to create the rest of the score. And of course, that was, real early on in my career. So I was able to try to remind myself of that on subsequent films. The Saw movies don't really apply because they're just their own little weird thing. And there have been a variety of different directors, and the only consistent creative force through all of them has been, of course, James and Lee and their character design and their overall supervision of the storylines, and Kevin, who edited all of them except one, I think, and then directed one, and the producers. And we got to the point, like when we were doing Spiral, they did have some guidance because it's a kind of a spin-off, not just a sequel. So they had some advice for how to stay in the Saw world without just rinse and repeating previous movies. But it was funny, one thing that listening to what Brad said that I'm guilty of is, you're in the meeting and you talk a great game and you describe this grandiose plan you're going to have for how you're going to approach the score and instruments you want to use. And then you get home and you go, what the hell did I do? I've promised them all this stuff, and which I probably can't deliver. And I can't even remember what I promised them. And then you wind up as per usual, as we all do, I'm sure, just sort of improvising your way through and feeling things out until you find the legs that this table can stand on. But the one skill that has been most important to me is basically being able to say, no, that's wrong. And as you're sitting there trying out sounds and melodies and ideas and rhythms and stuff, if you can develop a healthy reflex to put your hands on the keyboard and go, no, think no. And after if you do it enough, eventually you'll find a maybe, or possibly even a yes. And so that tends to be my sort of ham-fisted approach. But in terms of asking, in terms of a conversation with the director, I do always try to get out of them in the most abstract terms, because they're not going to be talking about, oh, I want major chords here and minor chords. It's never that musical of a discussion. It's usually so much more abstract. And you say, should we have a rhythm? Or should it be all floaty and ethereal? And like, that's almost too specific for a lot of directors, where they might kind of go, well, what do you mean? And you go, okay, guy, do you want drums or no drums? And so those questions, you kind of have to tiptoe your way around until you can coax out of them what they're seeing and avoiding any sort of musical terms. But the one question that I can usually ask in almost any kind of genre, whether it's, procedural police drama TV series or something like Saw, is when is it okay or not okay to telegraph through the music what's about to happen? Like, do we want this next thing to be a complete surprise and to pretend like that's not going to happen until it happens? Or do we want to allude to something bad as the guy's creeping into the abandoned warehouse? Do we want to pretend it's all innocent until the giant blade comes down and cuts him in half? Or do we want to have that sense of doom as he's walking in? And that's usually a question you can get a straight answer from a director or producer. And so that's one I do find myself coming back to, like, when and how much do we telegraph what's about to happen through the score?
Yeah. Mr. Harrison, you've had the opportunity to be a director working with some amazing composers, but you also were a composer working with one of the biggest icons of horror ever, George A. Romero. What was George's approach to music? Because when he first started out, it was a lot of library cues, like with Night of the Living Dead and things like that. And I don't even know if he had a composer until Martin with Donald Rubinstein, but you came in on Creepshow, and I know the original intention was not for you specifically to end up scoring it, but what was he like to work with as a composer, and what were some of the directions he gave you?
Well, the thing about George that people don't know is that even though he wasn't a musician, he had an incredible musical sense. He had one of the biggest collections of movie score recordings that I'd ever seen. And being a music lover, film music lover, it was really just a joy to sit with him. And he was a friend of mine, so we would just spend hours drinking scotch and listening to great recordings. So you could really tell his taste about what he wanted. But the whole Creepshow score was really kind of an accident, because I'm sitting here with this august company of great composers, and I have no, I shouldn't even be in the room in terms of my skill sets. But George and I were good friends, and he wanted me to be his assistant director at Creepshow. And so I had the benefit, which most composers don't have anymore, of a relationship with the director from day one all the way through post. So I was actually on the set sitting next to him through the entire movie. And you all know what it's like with the downtime. You're sitting around and you're bullshitting about one thing or another. And we would talk about, well, what would be good in this? What would be good in this scene? And George would he would just hum things. I'd be sitting there and he'd be like a tuba. He'd be going, boom, 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 boom. And I would listen to this stuff. So that when it finally came time to start supervising the music, because he asked me to do that, the original intention was to use Capitol Records library. And because that's the way he had done it before. And he's a terrific editor. So he would take 3 or 4 needle drops and he would cut them up into a new score. And it was really fantastic what he could do. And this is why I say he had this incredible musical sense. But the quality and the fidelity of some of these really didn't live up to the expectations of the movie. And I said, well, look, I've got some gear, because that's the way I started. I started as a musician, a band musician. I was just out on the road. I had no skills about becoming a composer at all, but I had this gear. And so I went in and I started noodling around to try and add to the library tracks, which didn't work, big fail. So then I would noodle something and I'd play it for him. He'd say, yeah, man, that's great. So one thing led to the next and it just became an elaborate thing. But I was listening to what Brad was saying about this, the narrative element of music. And I firmly believe this, that music, film music in particular, is as much a narrative element as the cinematography or the dialogue. And if it's done right, that doesn't mean it has to be wall to wall. That doesn't mean it has to tell you every emotion that's going on in the movie, but it should be a narrative element. And as Charlie was saying, do you make a decision about whether to tell people what is going to happen or what they should be feeling, or do you hold back and then accent it when it does? Those are story elements. And so I think of movie music as another story element in any movie. I had the luxury of sitting with a director and talking about all this. I don't know whether, Hitchcock had this relationship with Herman. I don't know whether John Williams has it with Spielberg. I don't know how intimate those guys get, but I know that they have developed relationships over time so that they know each other. In this case, I knew George really well. And not only that, I sat there and I could watch the whole movie and as it was coming together.
There's a question from Facebook. I'm going to say it's pronounced Devokees. Wants to know if you've ever had a score rejected, and if so, did you use elements of that score in scores that came after? Brad, have you ever had a score rejected, and did you ever save little nuggets from that rejected score and ended up using them elsewhere?
Well, it's interesting. Mists of Avalon, which was a big 3-hour TV thing, and the director, Uli Dell, who we'd worked together on 2 other projects, Rasputin with Alan Rickman and some, forget what the other one was. But anyway, he had a very specific idea about how he wanted the score to go. And I did a one-man show once, just kind of as self-therapy about some of my experiences growing up and whatever. And I quote this line, he's German, and he said, "The last thing I want is pretty Irish music." It was the Mists of Avalon, it was all about, it was from a woman's point of view. He was playing me pygmy music. I mean, he really wanted it to be this earthy thing about the power of the women on this island, right? And I went for it with him. He was into Bulgarian women's choir, the kind of dissonant, amazing music. So I kind of used that as an influence, and we went off in a way, and this is a long way around to the answer, but anyway, the head of TNT, I've forgotten her name, heard some test stuff that we were doing that he was really excited and I was excited, and she said, "Where's my pretty Irish music?" The reason I did this project is I love pretty Irish music. So I was gone, and you know, it's interesting. I never used that music again.
Yeah, well, it's pretty specific.
You know, a lot of times when the score is rejected, especially if it's a score that you like, it's kind of hard for me to go back to that stuff. And I'm not even sure legally if you're doing work for hire. I believe, especially this score was, I was about to getting close to recording it, so there were demos of all the stuff. I'm not even sure legally whether we're really allowed to.
Yeah, because you don't own the music that you score. The production owns it, right? Or the producers.
So I think they basically, everything you've created under on their payroll is technically theirs. So
yeah. What about you?
I have never. So simple answer, no. I have never used cues from rejected scores.
What about you, John Massari? Have you ever had something rejected? I know when I did the first book, Harry Manfredini discussed having something rejected. Chris Young discussed having something rejected and how it felt like his world was going to end when that happened the first time. You know, have you ever had something rejected? And one, you know, how do you deal with that as a composer? I mean, because obviously it's all business, but it's also kind of your art. So there's got to be something personal going on too.
Right. I am trying to, well, actually it happened last year.
Okay. Fresh wound.
The great thing about it is that I was in a position to basically rework the music and use it on an entirely different project. So it was a contractual situation where there's no hard, no foul, and I was able to do that. But however, there have been times where there's just no way, no chance in hell that I can bring that back. And there had been some things that had actually gone into production. We actually recorded, and for whatever reason, there's like a million of them. I don't want to go into big drama about it. They weren't able to use the music, and it had to do with more than just musical aesthetics. So now you have a piece of music that you poured your heart and soul into over a period of several months, and it sits on a shelf, and you can play it for your friends, and that's about it. And you just got to be happy with it. I mean, that's the way it is. You know, I tell kids coming up in the business that, you know, listen, you watch a professional baseball player. They strike out sometimes, and sometimes they get a home run. Sometimes the pitcher pitches a perfect game. Sometimes he has an awful game. He gets replaced in the first inning. It just happens. I think it was Henry Mancini or Lalo Schifrin said, you got to think of it like working on a film is like being on a bus trip. Sometimes you got to take a different bus. I don't know if that makes sense. You know, it's a vehicle to get to finish a piece of musical work. There's going to be another one, you know. So it's not the end of the earth. It feels like the end of the earth for like a few minutes, but you can't let that bother you. Just gotta keep pressing ahead.
Well, you know, during the first Score to Death book, where I had 14 composers interviewed for that, and then I did a podcast in between, and then doing this book, which has 16 composers. I mean, maybe I've been lucky, but I've every composer I've come across and interviewed, they've all, including yourselves, all been wonderful and gracious and nice, and it wasn't until after I had maybe done the first book when I started thinking about it and talking to other people about composers. And I have a theory that maybe part of the reason why you guys are all so great is because to do the job that you guys do as composers for film, you can't really have an ego, because it's just not, one, you'd either just be miserable doing that job, or two, you just wouldn't be good at it. Do you think there's anything to this idea that, you know, you guys do have to put kind of your own wants and needs aside sometimes to service the film? Charlie, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, to play off of some of the last couple conversations, I haven't had an entire score rejected, but I've definitely had some cues that got shot down. More often on TV series than on film stuff. And I actually I always looked at that as like a huge relief. And I was kind of secretly glad because, you know, on many of these TV series that I did, we were just cranking them out and they were wall to wall score. And I'd send in my, you know, back then it was send in a VHS tape or a DVD of the preview of the score so that they can correct anything before dub day. And I'd get a call back from the showrunner's assistant. He'd say, nope, no notes, it's all good. And then you think, did they even listen? Like, it can't have been that easy. And, or maybe the music just doesn't matter and nobody gives a shit. So like, that was kind of made me suspicious. But if they pointed their finger at one particular cue and said, you know what, that cue makes it sound like they're falling in love and it's more of a brother-sister thing. It should be sentimental, but not like romantic sentimental, if that makes sense. And if I would ever get that much information back from a showrunner or director or producer, I'd be like, I would be so happy because now I have a guidepost and I know, well, I know kind of, I mean, even if they just said, even if all the words they could put to it was, just not feeling it, or it's just not working for me, at least I knew what not to do. If they went so far as to describe like, oh, that's romantic sentiment and it should be tender-hearted, but not romance, then that would be like a wealth of information. And I would be so happy to have something that precise of a description of what I had done wrong and what to change. But in general, I loved getting, you know, having a cue turned down because at least then I knew where not to go. And, you know, sort of like a plowed road in a snowstorm. It's like if it's just a white an expanse of white with no fence posts or signs, you don't necessarily know if you're going to drive into a ditch. But if a snow plow or some signs are sticking up through the snow, at least you know how to avoid the ditch.
Yeah. One of the things that I find really interesting when I talk to all of you guys, and it's something that Brad, you and I discussed specifically, which is like, it seems like obviously in everybody's life and everybody's career, but since we're focusing on you guys, there is like a little element of like fate, like things have to fall into the right place. And whether it's your career and you meet the right person, or with a score. And Matthew Bellick asks a question that I think is a little bit in this vein, which is he asks if, what are some of your greatest happy accidents that helped shape either your career or your score? You know, these kinds of things happen all the time when we, especially in, I think in art, like something happens and then it ends up changing the trajectory of what you're doing. Holly, is there anything like that from a score or your career that, you know, stands out?
I mean, I'm trying to think. I don't know that I've, you know, like had one of those amazing stories where I ran into someone in the grocery store and then they hired me on a studio film or something.
Well, there is, in your case, there is a little bit of in that, like, I know maybe not now, but when you were a little bit earlier in your career, you were, you know, worried about, as being a female composer, worried about being typecast, doing rom-coms and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And it really took, I think it was Padraig Reynolds to really take a chance and say like, okay, I direct this horror movie. And that is what kind of like kicked open the door for you to have a career doing horror movies.
That's very true. And starting out, like, as young, like I listened to like James Horner and I liked like Braveheart and all those big dramatic things. And then, I met with Padraig and I was very worried. As I told you that I was a woman and also that my last name is Church. It's kind of a nice last name, you know, and I was like, will this guy hire me? Yeah, it's not horror conducive, you know, unless something bad's happening in the church. But I was worried I wouldn't get hired because of those two dumb little things. And he liked my music and we got along and he said, you're hired. And then I would say that is a happy accident. Like I've gone on to a horror trajectory because Padraig gave me that chance back then. So thank you, Padraig.
One of the things that we talked about in this vein when I spoke to you, Brad, was that you unbeknownst to the producers and Wes Craven, that you had this kind of like background and relationship with Haiti and Haitian music. So when you got kind of contacted almost in the 11th hour to do Serpent and the Rainbow, you were kind of the right guy for that job. Is there something to say about that? And also, what was it like working with Wes Craven as a director?
Well, it's interesting. My memory at this point, which isn't always great, is that my often music editor, Alan Rosen, at that point in time was working on that picture. And you know, it's so funny, we talk about directors and producers. So it's Haiti, right? And there's this incredible Afro-Haitian, Afro-Caribbean percussionist named Olatunji, right? World famous guy.
Yeah.
They're saying, we're gonna have him do the score, right? I mean, how more authentic can we get? Well, they needed more than percussion to tell the story, you know, to get the audience behind the emotions and the horror. So that was an interesting thing. So they threw that score out, and they were like, I forget what it was, 12 days left, something, I don't know. It was a very short amount of time. And Alan called and said, I recommended you for this thing, and they're kind of excited to talk to you about it. And it just kind of happened, and it did happen that I had from several visits in my younger life with my parents. I knew what Haiti felt like and sounded like. Though how much that impacted the score really doesn't. It's definitely there underneath. It's in part of the soul of it. The score that I felt the film needed, which is what they didn't get the first time around, was this almost sometimes spiritual quality to it, because there's this whole element that it's about Serpent and the Rainbow, and this will branch into the Wes Craven thing. Serpent and the Rainbow was actually a political best-selling book. It was really about using this idea of voodoo and zombies and all that, completely fake, right, to oppress the people. How the government forces embellished. They actually had a drug that made it seem like people were dying, and then they would come out of it, oh, it's a zombie. And the voodoo, that it was using, in a sense, religion as an oppressive force, this particular belief system. And it was not a horror thing at all. So then Wes comes in, he's really excited because, you know, he's doing a movie that is not a horror film. He wants to draw everybody. Nobody wants to be, I mean, maybe this isn't true, and you guys could tell me, but most artists want freedom. They want openness to do different things. They don't want to necessarily be pigeonholed in one slot. So he was excited about this. So that gave me permission to not do a typical horror score, to do a score that had some of the cultural underpinnings, but this other whole level of the characters and the politics and all this stuff. Well, they screened it for the marketing, you know, for the test marketing, and some of the audience was pissed off. This is Wes Craven. Where is the go for the throat moment, you know? And they literally went back and reshot and shot some additional footage, and then I had to go back and rescore to give it more of the jump out of your seat, some of those moments, and a little bit more of the horror element in it. I mean, it's pretty horrific to be buried alive, okay? I mean, that was always there, but there's just a certain style and certain way that the bad guy was treated and all that got more stylized and less real. And then the music had to shift to do that. But yeah, that was one of those things where it just dropped in my lap, and I happened to have a connection. I think they really hired me because what I've been doing recently, not because I had this Haitian connection.
Yeah.
I think that they sent me the film, and I did a couple of things for them. They hired me first, and they were like rushing around doing other stuff. So I don't even know that we had that conversation before I was hired, or even when I originally started. But yes, it was kind of a funny coincidence.
By everybody's account, Wes Craven was a pretty intellectual guy. What was he like as a director to work with? Because you also worked with him on some television projects, right?
Yeah, super smart guy, really sweet man, really just really intelligent and a little heady, really, one of those guys that, you see something and it's really kind of visceral and there's all these layers that are in him about it. It's not necessarily what the audience is going to experience. And in some cases, I didn't even want to go there because it would like kind of tie me in knots a little bit to have too many intellectual thoughts about what I'm looking at, which is a moment that needs support, in some way. So, but really, really enjoyed working with him and was very surprised. And it's really funny. There was another connection that we had, which was when I was back in New York, trying to be a rock and roll star or a singer songwriter or whatever. And I was at Paul Simon's publishing company. I was auditioning for Clive Davis as a piano player, songwriter kind of guy. And the guy who was producing me and taking me around and producing my demos at that point had a little gig on the side. And he said, I'm doing this acting gig in this movie. And I didn't realize till years later that the movie was Last House on the Left. And this guy's name was David Hess, right?
Wow.
Who's not with us anymore. But it was just another one of these weird connections because this was like, I think that was the first thing Wes ever did. It seemed like, from what I was hearing from this guy, that it was a real down and dirty shoot, no money, no time.
John Harrison, you, in a similar vein, but also very different. Your score for Day of the Dead kind of, if I recall correctly, was kind of born out of a different draft of the script that had much more of a Caribbean, scenario going on. And then by the time you guys made the movie, it's that had changed, but you had all these cues. And Day of the Dead is one of my favorite scores ever. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about scoring that film, working with George on that, and how that change in the script altered the approach or not altered the approach going into that.
Oh yeah, well, it didn't alter the approach, and that was the interesting thing about it, because George's original script was a much bigger movie, and because the executive producers, the money guys at the time, wouldn't release it unrated. They wanted an R rating, which meant that George would have to tone down the nature of the movie, which he didn't want to do. So they said, well, okay, if you don't want an R rating, you want it unrated, we'll cut the budget in half, which meant that the script that he had could not be made. But I had been working on some theme ideas, which I was sending him, which he fell in love with. And that script took place in the Caribbean. And it wasn't about voodoo or anything like that, but it was about the end of the world and people trying to escape it. And so there were themes in there that George really liked. Well, the revised script was all about guys trapped in a cave underground in the middle of Western Pennsylvania somewhere. And I had all of these like sort of Caribbean themes that didn't quite work with the environment of the movie, but George loved the music, and so he wanted me to elaborate on it, which I did. And it's interesting what Brad said about Serpent and the Rainbow, because when Day of the Dead came out, the movie didn't do that well at first. And one of the things that people said that they hated about it was the score, because they said, where's the horror music? There's all this like weird kind of Caribbean music, and there are these romantic themes. And the point that George and I were trying to do was to go really to be counterintuitive a little bit and play against the grim, dark hopelessness of that movie. And we thought that it leavened the horror of it to some extent. And because George always wanted to say more within his movies than just like, okay, a bunch of zombies are going to come and get you and you're either going to escape or they're going to eat you. So he had a lot of political things to say in those movies.
Yeah.
But it was interesting because it was kind of depressing for all of us. The movie didn't do well. People hated the score, but whatever it is, 35, 40 years later, it's like it continues to be released, and kids love it that weren't even born when we made the movie. So
Yeah.
it's kind of a weird thing how they go into circles. But yeah, it was a complete, I don't know whether you'd call it a happy accident. I had the advantage, of course, of also being George's assistant director. So while we were making the movie, again, I was with him the entire time.
Yeah.
And I also had the advantage, which some of the rest of us can talk about. I wasn't handed the movie at the end and said, okay, you've got 7 weeks to deliver the score. I was with it the whole time. And when we went into the editing process, I set up my gear in the studio, and I was able to attempt the movie with the score we were actually going to do.
Yeah.
I wasn't handed a movie and here's the temp score that we've got. This kind of gives you an idea of what we're after and all that stuff, which of course drives every composer nuts.
Yeah.
But, the worst thing you want to hear is a director saying, well, just do it like a temp. You can't use that music, but just imitate that.
Yeah. John, it's amazing how, in the grand scheme of things, you didn't score that many movies, but the scores that you did have had this like amazing bit of longevity with Creepshow and Day of the Dead.
That happened,
and,
because I never set out to do that. I mean,
well, of course
I was
not.
having fun with my friend, and I was the guy with the piano,
Yeah.
didn't have any money, so it's like, oh, you got a piano? All right, you do it. But that's the way George was. And that was what was wonderful about him as a filmmaker.
Yeah.
Because if you wanted to, and back in Pittsburgh, back in the day, it was really independent filmmaking. There was no Weinstein Company. There was no Sony Classics. It was just like, let's pull it together with whatever we can. I mean, for several films, when we started out, George didn't even want a call sheet on the set. He just, tell everybody to show up at 7:00 and we'll figure out what we're going to do.
Yeah. Well, John Massari, I mean, you've had a kind of a similar experience in that, this wacky yet often beautiful and also kind of rockin' score that you did for this crazy clown movie in the 80s has not just lived on with fans and releases, but you also last year or 2 years ago took the opportunity to like create an orchestrated for an orchestra and perform it live. What has it been like? Well, one, can you talk a little bit about like why that score was not orchestral in the beginning? Was it strictly budgetary or was it a creative choice? And then talk a little bit about how like Killer Clowns from Outer Space has kind of taken on, a life of its own, and the music has too. And now there's news that the saga may continue.
Yes, the saga may continue, and that is something I can't comment on. I wish I could. I wish I knew something. I only know what I can do. And I'm very, very fortunate that I've kind of inherited this family of nieces and nephews and people that somehow identify with the movie, the creative, odd aspect of the movie, and the music is married to that odd aspect. So I'm a element of the aspect of the movie, the spirit of the movie that people can get in contact with and communicate with. And I'm so fortunate with that because I've met some absolutely wonderful people. But the germ of the movie, the actual movie by itself, when I first saw it in a screening room at Warner Brothers Pictures, there was no tent music whatsoever. It was very creepy. And I just said, this is my movie. I have to be doing it. And I'm not going to mention names, but there were a lot of people that wanted to do that movie as well. And I think what I did, and at first I thought maybe this is a mistake. I took the premise of the movie was really crazy and wacky. I didn't want to do crazy and wacky music. I did very legit kind of drama, you know. And at the time I was listening to Beastie Boys and I loved Frank Zappa. And so I came up with this crazy march that was actually written 15 years before with my band. We used to play Led Zeppelin and, you know, high school proms and dances. And I wrote the song for our band and they didn't want to play it because it sounded too jazzy. So when I finally saw the movie, I said, that thing I wrote when I was 17 is going to be perfect here. You know, it was like 12 years later or 15 years later or what have you. And I think people kind of hear that awkwardness, you know, it was like music from a younger kid that was trying to create something original. And I made that the Killer Clown March, this disjointed kind of theme that's actually a D major 7 chord. Then that's why my band didn't want to play it, because they thought D major 7 chord is too jazzy. We don't play jazz, John. We play rock. D major 7 is a jazz chord. So anyways, it's so funny because there's only one member of the band that gets that story. The rest of the guys don't even remember that actually happening. But I think because the movie is, it's the movie every crazy kid would have wanted to make. I don't know. There's just something crazy and creative about that movie that people identify with, and they have a home in that movie, and I always welcome them to send me their artwork and their music manifestations. And so that's the beauty. That's the beauty of Killer Clowns from Outer Space. We have a giant family throughout the world that gets that basically insane movie.
I have this is an odd question, but in doing the new book, I discovered that Charlie, you originally had planned on being an architect. Craig Saffin also planned on being an architect. Brad, you are interested in architecture and kind of dabble with it now. Is there something, and also Michael Abels worked in an office that was an architect firm and actually did some drafting for them. Is there something to architecture and film scoring that we need to know?
May I chime in? You left my name out. I was dead serious. High school going into college, I wanted to be an architectural illustrator or a technical illustrator for, like, you know, used aircraft or something like that. And there's something about the meticulousness of design that I like, that basically the call of music was far too strong. Yeah. So you can add me to that list too.
Okay, well, what about you, Charlie? Also, Charlie, when you describe how you work, sometimes it's architectural. You know, you're putting up beams and walls.
Yeah. And I mean, I still use those analogies, like, you know, you're making a wireframe version of the cue, or you're, you know, when the director says, how close are we on this scene? You say, well, I got the studs up. I still need to drywall it and paint it. You know? And I use those kind of analogies all the time because, you know, that's term, you know, every director has had their kitchen redone sooner or later. And so if you describe to them how you're doing, you know, your progress on the score in terms of a half destroyed kitchen that's taking way too long to get finished, that's usually they can kind of figure out what you mean about how close we are to a finish line. But I think there is some like desire for precision and order and symmetry that is inherent in wanting to be an architect, and, you know, that kind of thing. There are many parallels in music composition that you want things, you want to be able to ascertain whether a piece of music is balanced or symmetrical, or whether it's leaning over too far to one side because you didn't brace that side enough. And sometimes you want the piece of music to be lopsided and to be on the verge of collapsing. But you kind of, I think there's a lot of parallels between, you know, mocking up a cue or framing up a rhythm track and for a long chase sequence. You know, I always one of the first things I always do when I have to deal with like a 9-minute long chase and break into the house and run from the cops scene or whatever is work out get very detailed and work out the tempo map. And I always think in my mind that that's much like, you know, putting up all the studs and the framing. And because once that's done, you can just call in the drywall crew and they can slap up the drywall and put the mud and the paint and you're done. And if I have a good tempo map for a long and elaborate cue, then it becomes so easy. And to the point where I've played cues for James Wan that were literally nothing but a click with a very elaborate tempo and time signature map. And I would kind of sing along to the click because I was way behind schedule. And he was like, can we hear that big long scene? I say, well, I really, you know, I've spent a few days on it, but all I really have is a click track. And he'd be like, really? And I said, but I can play it for you. It's no problem. And I would play him this very elaborate thing where the tempos would gradually get faster and then stop right when the guy opens the door. And then it slows down. And then there's a bar of 5/4. And then the guy shoots the gun. And as this whole click track is playing, like literally would just beep, boop, 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 I would be singing along and like playing drums on my legs and kind of going, it's going to be like this. Trust me, it'll be great. And I'd be sort of going, it'll be like, and that was sort of enough to get the idea across. And I liken that, you know, I compare that experience to, you know, going to visit the site of your much behind schedule, but still only half built house, your dream house. And you know, you're meeting with the contractor and the architect, and all there is a bunch, what looks like a bunch of toothpicks jabbed into the ground. And he's going, that's over there, it's going to be the kitchen. And over there is going to be the lounge. And so I think there is, you know, a lot of parallels between architecture or building and construction and engineering and that sort of thing, and technical drawing, and that desire for control over something that's abstract, you know.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, we're running out of time. Let's see if we can get to one or two more of the viewer questions. Dale Turner wants to know if there's a favorite instrument or instruments that conjure creepiness for you. What about you, Holly?
Well, as far as like groups, I love strings. I mean, you can just do so much with them. They can make all kinds of creepy sounds. So I would have to say I love my string section.
Brad, when you were scoring horror stuff, was there something that was a go-to or something that you enjoyed, or was it more experimental for you?
It was more experimental. I usually was trying to create something that maybe had never been exactly heard before as the basis, you know, as the texture, as the sound. You know, if there was melody, there was other structure, but yeah, there was no, that was part of the play, you know. It's like that part where somewhere deep in my subconscious imagination, I know there is the right thing, and it's just the journey to get to that sound that evokes that. You know, that's outside of working with a typical orchestra setting.
Sure.
Places where, you know, like Just Before Dawn, it was in the woods, so I was hearing this. Finally, found this little ocarina thingy that sounded kind of like this haunted bird out in the thing, you know.
Charlie, you have a knack for picking either recorded sounds that you've collected over the years. We know that I know that you also have a fascination with like bowed metal instruments and finding really weird tones. Is there anything specific that you like, or is it just specific to the film?
I mean, it's usually specific to the film, but there, you know, because there's some cases where something like dissonant choirs like Gheorghe Ligeti wouldn't be appropriate, even though you want something scary and dissonant. But the fact of it being recognizable as a choir or whatever might be it might not feel like the right diameter. You know, it might feel like if it's a small and intimate scene that wants to be terrifying, and it's not a scene about conjuring up thousands of dead spirits that are haunting this space, then having some dissonant choir that sounds like 1,000 people in a church in Prague might kind of run counter to what you're seeing on the screen. But yes, I'm a huge fan of any you know, I'm sure we all have a water phone sitting on top of a speaker in our living room, and of course I keep my bowed metal nearby. So this is my favorite.
This is called K Lastas, this instrument. Let's see if we can hear it. Fortunately, we're not picking it up, Charlie. But this is an instrument that Charlie got, which has a giant piece of metal with strings attached to it.
And it's, you know, it's nothing that we haven't, it's in a family of sounds that we've all heard and used. It's sort of like the hot rodded version of a bowed cymbal. But those kind of, you know, the first time I ever heard that classic and much overused sample called Rusty Spoke that I'm sure all of us have attempted to use.
Right.
You think, oh, that's the greatest sound. There must be a whole family of sounds like that I can exploit. And that the adventure with these sculptural instruments, like this thing I just played, are an attempt to like make my own version of that great character and quality of sounds that immediately sound like something bad is going to happen, but aren't trying to trick the violin players into ruining their expensive bow by scraping diagonally or something.
Yeah. Alexander Taylor asked about, we talked a little bit about it with Holly, this, you know, fear of pigeonholing. John Massari, do you feel like you've been pigeonholed as a horror composer? And if so, is it something that you like, or is it frustrating?
I wish I was pigeonholed as a horror composer. I write more family kind of music than anything. You know, I mean, I love horror film. And back to the, you know, what's the scary sound? There's an instrument that sometimes I like to use one naked, isolated sound. There's an instrument called the lion's roar, and it's basically a drum that you draw a gut string chord through, and it basically sounds like flatulence. All right, but if it's recorded, if you perform it in a beautiful hall, it sounds like this dying creature, you know, that's calling from the depths of their soul. But you know, listen, Killer Clowns is a blessing and a curse, because some people, I'll play them other music that I do and they just don't, well, it's not Killer Clowns, I'm not interested, you know. And there are other people, you know, there's music on mine that plays all over the world. It sounds nothing like Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Yeah. So do I have any, it's a blessing and a curse, I guess you can say, but I tend to go more toward the blessing part.
Yeah. What about you, Brad?
I don't know if that answers your question.
Brad, you scored all kinds of things from, you know, big, elaborate television movies to, you know, The Accused, which is, you know, award-winning drama. But many people will always know you best as the Terminator guy or the Fright Night guy. Is that troubling?
No, I agree with John. I mean, I think there was a point where when I was looking for work, which I'm no longer in that area of working for hire, where it was sometimes frustrating. I mean, I was very lucky after the first Terminator. I got a call to do a comedy with Susan Sarandon and Raul Julia called Compromising Positions, because the director was one of those few guys who said, I saw the Terminator, you did a good job on that. I think you can do a good job on this. It's like, oh, thank you. You know, but that's really, really great. No, the one little funny anecdote is that you know, there's one guy, I guess, that did a cover on the Terminator theme. You don't even see him. You see keyboards and he's doing like the whole thing. And I think it had something like 7 million plus hits on it or something like that. And when I wrote the musical, I'm like thinking, if I can get like 0.1% of those people to come along and listen to a musical that has nothing to do with this, where I wrote the script and no, I didn't get there. I mean, I got a few thousand, you know, but it's really interesting how people latch on to something like what John, like what you were talking about. They latch on to something that you have to really take it in after a while. I think I've gotten old enough and wise enough to say, there's something there. People aren't stupid. There's something that's, it's not just, okay, the movie was, you know, an iconic movie, but there's something in that where I hit some part of my intuition or whatever. And talk about happy accidents. I felt like every good thing I ever did was a happy accident, truthfully. But something there and people connect. How can you can't dispute that. You have to just say, wow, I'm glad I got to do something that people connect with, you know?
Mm-hmm.
I've watched that YouTube video of the guy dissecting the T2 score and fishing through the ProSonus brass library and finding the exact sample. And I've watched that video a bunch of times because, as you said, Brad, it's whether or not you were trying to make it an iconic moment in movie music history, or whether you just were speeding through it and trying to get it done as quick as possible, that kind of doesn't matter, because whatever elements combined to in the cultural timeline of human experience, that became like a moment where, for a lot of people, whether they're film viewers or musicians or filmmakers, everything changed. And it was like there's before T2 and there's after T2. And like that, whether or not anybody knows it at the time, that was the case. And I still,
you guys know it was survival, man. It was just like, I got, come on,
Right.
you know.
Right.
I think sometimes that chaos is where the best stuff comes from. You know?
just
You
the
don't have
pure
time to
panic.
think or second guess. You're just like grabbing stuff and doing stuff. You know?
And it works so well. I've watched that stupid movie more than 100 times easily, and I can't find you. It's like the Egyptian pyramids where they go and they try to fit a playing card in between the stones because they're so perfectly built.
Right.
And
Right.
that freaking movie, you can't fit a playing card. There's not a frame, a molecule. There is nothing that could be improved upon, whether it's the even the crude CGI, like whatever there is about that movie, the score, the acting, the story development, everything, it's freaking perfect. So to just have, whether or not anybody knew it was at the time and was just in a panic trying to do their best work, fantastic. But it's, you know, I see why that guy's YouTube video where he dissects the score and tries to recreate it, I can see why it has so many millions of hits, because everybody wants to know, how was that magic created?
It's interesting that, and I feel like, aside from the architecture thing, like I feel like Charlie and Brad, you guys, I don't know if you guys know each other at all, but you guys are kind of like kindred spirits in the way that you approach sound. And talking to both of you and knowing you both a bit, people might not know this, but Brad, for a very short time, was the touring keyboardist for Hall & Oates, and Charlie was the touring keyboardist for what some would call the Hall & Oates of the 90s, Nine Inch Nails.
Right.
But
They're basically the same band, you know.
But as we wrap it up, Holly, you know, going back to this idea of being pigeonholed and typecast, I know there was something that do you still worry about that? You know, obviously we have four lovely gentlemen here and many more in the book, but you are a little bit of an oddity in the world of film scoring, and especially horror film scoring.
A rarity.
As the scream queen of scoring. Are you happy that you're now associated with horror, or is there other things that you still like to do?
I love horror. I'm so happy that it's happened this way, and I love kind of being an oddity and a rarity, actually. So I just love that, you know, like we talked about, I didn't know it was going to go this way, but I really love that it has, you know. So I embrace it. I love it. I love, you know, that anyone even knows me at all, but that they know me for horror is fantastic, you know. So I'm all in. Pigeonhole me.
As someone who has an interest in your early interests in film music were more classical, and you know, unfortunately today both both fortunately and unfortunately, technology has gotten in the way of being able to use orchestras and shrinking budgets and whatnot. How are you navigating that? Is it frustrating for you, or is it liberating in a weird way to be working alone?
Is this for me?
Yeah.
Still, or oh,
I'm
okay.
still talking to you, Holly.
Okay, just being sure. Yeah, no, I do miss having big orchestral sessions. That happens once in a while where you get to record. That's a pretty magical moment, I think all of us could say. But I've gotten used to it. I like the samples and programming and working on stuff, recording what I can, finding weird sounds when I can. It's just the way things are, right? So yeah, you just find the fun in that and get creative with whatever your limitations are, I think.
Sure. John, I'm sure you worked more, John Massari, you worked more with orchestras probably earlier in your career than you did throughout the 80s into the 90s and stuff. How's that change in the landscape of scoring affected you as an artist in terms of, do you like it? Is it just different?
Well, you asked me a question about budgetary with Killer Clowns specifically. There was a budget to do it with an orchestra, but the Kyoto brothers would say, we don't want it to sound like a horror film. It's recorded by an orchestra. Can you take electronic instruments and have the music be classically influenced, greatly influenced, but use the colors of all the, what we would call now, or the vintage synthesizers of the day. But no, I like, I love creating music, and if it's with an orchestra, that's wonderful. And if it's with synthesizers and samples, that also is absolutely wonderful. I don't know if I lost you guys. There you go. You're back again. If it's with a very few instruments or a lot of instruments, it's the spirit of the music that's going to come through. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've been going for over an hour. I hate to end it because as as everybody will discover if you pick up Scored to Death 2, yeah, I can talk to all of these people for way more than an hour.
Oh, I can listen to Charlie forever.
Individually. The interview that Charlie and I did was a whopping 4.5 hours.
That's short, huh?
In one sitting.
Sorry.
And it was
That's
wonderful.
Okay.
Anyway, I want everybody to make sure you check out Holly Amber Church on social media. Check out Brad's Full Circle Musical on SoundCloud. John Massari is also active on social media. John Harrison, do you have anything coming up that we should know about?
I'm setting up the gear to do a couple of projects, which I probably can't talk too much about, but I just appreciate the fact that the few things that I did in the past are still out there. I mean, I got the thing back here. I play all the time, so you never know.
Well, we'd love to hear more music from John Harrison. Charlie, you've got Spiral from the Book of Saul coming up, which was supposed to be earlier this year, but because of COVID got pushed back. Is there anything you can tell us about that score? That
it's a little different. It's like some legacy band out on tour. We play all the hits, but it's set in sort of outside of the normal Saw universe to a certain extent. So it doesn't all take place in some dank dungeon at the bottom of an abandoned warehouse. So there's a different character to a lot of the score, which was actually a kind of a relief to not have to just instantly descend into some abandoned warehouse with rusty metal chains swinging back and forth, as in most of the previous ones. So it was nice. I was grateful for a chance to stay in the Saw universe, but maybe be on a different Saw planet, if that makes sense.
Well, make sure you check out everybody. I want to thank Fangoria for letting us come and do this and for letting me host it. Of course, check out fangoria.com, subscribe to the magazine, check them out on social media at Fangoria. Again, my name is J. Blake Fichera. The book is Scored to Death 2, which actually I guess is this way. And unfortunately, Amazon's having a hard time getting it up, but it'll be there soon. And if you really want a copy before that, you can check it out right straight from my publisher, Silman James Press. And thanks so much, ladies and
Thank you.
gentlemen. This was a lot of fun. I wish we could have
Nice
done
meeting
more of
you
that.
all.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You
Great,
too.
great hanging out with you all.
And thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye.